very loudly, so hopefully you guys can hear me without a microphone. Are we good? Yeah? Okay, well, as Kate said, thank you guys very much. Incredible location. The last time I did this presentation to this group, I was in Sydney, and we actually had, now Kate's going to make fun of the way I pronounce this, but a kookaburra flew into the room. So on top of having to present to a load of people in Lycra, we had a bird going in the middle of the session. So hopefully we won't have that. I think the doors are closed, so we're safe. We'll see. So I want to talk to you today about the myths of what I see as the myths of workplace innovation and how also we can use our understanding of innovation into creating better employee engagement. So a little bit about myself. This is me. Can you see? Resemblance, workplace nerd. So a bit about myself. I am founder of a company called Hatch Analytics. I had a little bit of a dog-leg journey to the work that I'm doing. I started as studying design in undergrad and then went on to study organizational behavior, but for a short period of time I was a homicide investigator for the Department of Justice. I worked with men and women on Florida's death row, trying to understand how to exonerate them, basically. And what I learned through that process was two key things that have influenced the way that I look now at the workplace. One of them is the incredible impact that space has on behavior. So the fact is that our physical space, our community space has a tremendous impact on our behavior. And the second is what happens when you remove autonomy from an individual, when you take away their series of choices, and what that starts to do to their ability to function, and not just take away their choices in a prison environment, but also take away the choices that they may have in their lives, in their community. And so this has influenced the way that I take a look at the workplace now. A bit about Hatch, the company that I founded. Hatch is actually an acronym. It stands for Human Analytics, Think, Connect, Hatch, and that's what we do. We're workplace consultants, so we look at the intersection between people and property and how businesses leverage that understanding of that intersection for better organizational performance. And we do that using human analytics, so basically tools that help us understand how a business thinks, how they connect, and how they hatch new ideas, how they innovate. So one of the big myths that I see today is this right here, this idea of creativity. And this is also just good for a good laugh, isn't it? You get back to that goddamn cubicle and start thinking outside the box. We tend to think of this idea of creativity being, that we can drive someone to do it. But it's quite interesting. There was a study done by Accenture that found that 80% of respondents said one of the primary things that they were expected to do was to come up in their job, come up with new ideas. And so this is obviously one of the primary drivers in business is we will come up with something new. But unfortunately, it doesn't work this way. We can't just say, go think, go be different. So what are some of the myths that I've seen about how we can actually create new thinking? The first is this one, and I think this is really powerful. It's the idea of the creative type, right? We know there's a type that can be creative, a type that's innovative. We think maybe they've got like dubious facial hair, maybe like paint under their fingernails, right? That's the creative type. But I love this quote from Albert Einstein. He says, everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. So one of the things that I want to encourage people to recognize is that it's not about being that type. You can be creative in accounting, maybe not too creative in accounting, but there's all different types of ways that you can tap into that creativity that exists. It's not just about a certain typology. The next, and this is a little, I'm going to say this is probably one of the more controversial statements that I'll make, this idea of trusting our gut. Now I recognize that a lot of people think it's important to trust their gut. And as a homicide investigator, there's no question that when the hair on the back of my neck stood up, I knew that that meant something. So there's absolutely, even Einstein, going back to Einstein, he said, I'll see if I can get this right, he said that our rational mind, our intuitive mind is the master and our rational mind is the servant. But we now worship the servant and have forgotten the master. So he even said, as brilliant as he was, that the intuitive mind is something that we can't ever forget. But the challenge is, and this is one of the things that I'll challenge you to consider, is are we actually following our intuition, are we following our gut, or are we following our bias? And I think it's something to recognize, in particular as executives, as we're trying to create new innovation, we see things through a particular lens. And that lens sometimes is not actually the lens of what we can analyze, but it's the lens of our bias. And I'll give you a great example. If you guys have read The Tipping Point, anybody here read The Tipping Point? There's an excellent example in there where he talks about one of the challenges with there not being enough women first chairs in orchestras. So the people that ran orchestras, the directors of orchestras said there's not enough women first chairs. We have to get into the depth of understanding why this is happening. So they started doing huge research projects. Is it that women aren't encouraged enough as children? Is it that they don't have access to the same kind of studies that men do? Why is it that when there's not enough women first chairs? These people that were all men wanted to really understand the problem. They were coming at it from a purity of intention to understand the challenge. And somebody said, wait a minute, why don't we try something? Why don't we do blind auditions? People go, well, we obviously want more women first chairs. That's not going to have any impact on the outcome. Spoiler alert, yeah, it did actually. 5 times as many women were selected as first chairs when they did blind auditioning. So these were people who had no belief that they were being biased in their decision making. But when given the opportunity to have bias removed from them, they reacted in a very different way. And so it's just to say that sometimes when we think we're following our gut, and again, this is really powerful. I'll give you an example of the power of some of the hardwiring. It took mice who had never been exposed to cats ever in a laboratory setting, and they put a bit of cat pheromone on a piece of towel and stuck it in front of the mice, and they shrunk in fear. So there is something that's hardwired in our brains to understand what's happening in our environment. But just always be balancing that idea of trusting your gut with following your bias. This is a great one. The lone mad genius. We love this idea. This is almost an archetype, is it? The idea that there's this lone person who comes up with these ideas and they're a little bit off-center. I'm not going to argue with you that Vinnie Van Gogh here isn't just a little bit left of center. If anybody's gotten an ear in the mail as a love letter, perhaps you can say it's a bit strange. But what I'd like to sort of confront is that he wasn't actually alone. You know, we do like this idea, though, of the mad genius. I think there's the philosopher, the ancient philosopher Seneca said that there's a tincture of madness in genius. And I love that idea. Just a tincture, you know, just a drop, just one drop, and that's all it takes. But as an example, he wasn't alone. He was very much part of a community of people. And so, yes, sometimes we like to say that it's somebody that's a little bit crazy that comes up with new ideas, and I'll allow that. I'll allow, you know, Norman Mailer said every book I wrote made me a little crazy or a little madder. But basically, these people are working in community, and I'm going to touch on that being, I think, the key element in engagement and how you can build competitive advantage in your businesses is by creating a community of geniuses in your work environment. And it's really interesting because when we talk about genius and what genius is, I think it's important to recognize where that word comes from. So the word genius was actually coined by the Romans, and what the Romans said is that you weren't a genius. That genius was actually something that alighted upon you. It was out in the ether, and if you created the right environment, if you created the right kind of setting, then genius would alight upon you. And I think that to me brings me a lot of comfort, I guess, that it's not that me as an individual, I'm not that genius, it's that you can create that environment. We became genius as an individual when we started looking at more of the individual elements during the Renaissance, where we said, okay, no, you're a genius. But I prefer the Roman description of a genius, which is that we create an environment where genius can alight upon us. And one of the ways we do that is by creating communities. The next is brainstorming. Admit it. How many of you said, let's go brainstorm about this? Come on. Come on. And I find myself, it comes out of my mouth, even though I know that it's rubbish, it still just slips out of my mouth. So a little bit of a history about brainstorming. So brainstorming was developed by a guy named Alex Osborne, and he was the founder of BBDO. I know that you guys have a BBDO here, and he's the O of BBDO. And this was during 1948, so this is sort of pre-Mad Men, crazy advertising era. And he said, you know, this is the thing about brainstorming. Ideas are like a delicate flower. This is his verbiage, not mine, are a delicate flower that need to be nurtured in an environment without criticism. So we know how brainstorming works, right? You're supposed to throw lots and lots of ideas, and no one criticizes, and then out of it comes great innovation. But here's the trick. 10 years later, in 1958, Yale University did a study, and they found that actually people who worked alone found 2 times as many new ideas than people working in a brainstorming environment. Now, who came up with even more ideas? People working in teams, but critical teams. Teams where people were able to express themselves and then be critical about the ideas, which is one of the key elements you're not supposed to do in brainstorming. Why also does brainstorming not work? Because it too heavily weights the extrovert. So I know I'm an extrovert, I'm the noisiest person in the room, I happen to think I have the best ideas, probably do, no. So the extrovert tends to be overly weighted, and I actually think this is one of the problems in our work environments as well. Anybody here work in open plan? Yeah, okay. Well, one of the problems with activity-based working as a design concept is that people who are in open plan, most of those designs were done out of a focus group. And who's the noisiest person in the focus group? The extrovert. And so you have spaces that are all designed based on focus groups of designers with the noisiest person in the room saying this is how I'll work best. So it's something to consider that if we create brainstorming, if we create focus group environments where the noisiest person gets heard, it can be quite dangerous. I'm going to show you a short video by a woman named Susan Cain, and she talks about the power of the balance of great teams and how great teams come up with new ideas and innovation, and that's the balance of an extrovert and an introvert. And hopefully
you take a group of people and put them into a meeting and have them talk about something. The opinions of the loudest person or the most charismatic person or the most assertive person, those are the ones that the group tends to follow. And yet, researchers have looked at this. There's no correlation between being that best talker and having the best ideas. Like 0 correlation. I think that we're living in a society now that is so overly extroverted. As we shifted from an agricultural economy to a corporate one, we started to admire people who could be magnetic and charismatic. These were the qualities that seemed to matter for job interviews and things like that. And so in the earlier agricultural economy, our self-help books used to have titles like character, the grandest thing in the world. But then the self-help books later on became the ones that we kind of know of today, like Dale Carnegie's How to Influence People. And those were all about teaching us to be more entertaining, more dynamic, that kind of thing. You know, I think for any trait of human nature, any aspect, it has its pros and it has its cons. And what I'm saying is that for too long we've looked at introversion only through its disadvantages. We've looked at extroversion only through its advantages. So down with extroverts, up with introverts. And my vision of the right world is a world where it's yin and yang, you know, and there's space for extroverts and there's space for introverts, and it's equal space. If you look at the birth of Apple computer, we tend to associate Apple with Steve Jobs, who was this dazzling showman. But really, the person who invented the Apple computer was a different Steve. It was Steve Wozniak. By himself in a cubicle at Hewlett Packard, where he was working at the time, late at night, early in the morning, before anybody was at work. He worked by himself for months, and then he produced this amazing thing that he then shared with his friend Steve Jobs. And then it was Steve Jobs who said, hey, we should start a company with this. This is amazing. Without Steve Jobs, none of it ever would have come to pass. So it was this combination of letting the self think his deep way, and then having partnership between the two. And in fact, in companies, it's been found that the most effective teams are the ones that are a combination of introvert and extrovert. And the two types are really drawn to each other and really need each other.
So I've been told that, let's see, is this one on? I've been told that maybe people can't hear me in the back, which is going to be the first time that I've ever been told that in my life. Usually everybody's going, you're an 11, Monica. Can you just take it down to like a 6, maybe? But we want everyone to hear. So this is another myth that I like, and this touches on what I talked about just a moment ago about sort of the design and how different designs in a work environment can influence innovation. There's no question we've all heard of googly design, right? We've seen the different the slides, and we've seen the beanbag chairs, and you think, okay, I'll just put a beanbag chair and you go be creative, and that's going to create creativity, right? But I want to tell you a story that I think is like the anti-Google design, but actually created some of the greatest inventions in human history. This is Building 20. This is a building that was built, intended to be a temporary structure. It actually stood for 50 years. And this is at MIT's radar lab in Massachusetts. And this was built just after the outbreak of World War II. And the reason it was built was because they needed to house the radar lab. Obviously, radar becoming incredibly important in order to win the war. And so they created this space, and it was a terrible building. It was cold in the winter, it was hot in the summer, it leaked, it smelled. It was absolutely a nightmare. But this space incubated weather radar, Chomsky linguistics, Bose acoustics, the atomic clock, all came out of this space. Now, why is that? Well, for starters, because it had big giant brains knocking around in it. And they also credit that it had one big floor plate. So basically, if people wanted to visit the piano tuning facility that was at one end, we're knocking into each other. But this is the key element why people credit this being such an incubator. They had complete and total autonomy over the way that they functioned in the space. They self-selected where they sat. They found their own offices. There were offices, but they'd take down walls. Gerald Zacharias in the weekend, to build his atomic clock, actually went in with some of his friends and just took out a floor. So if any of you are in facilities or health and safety, you're starting to rock back and forth now. Like, oh God, go to my happy place. But this is the exact example of what Stuart Brand calls low road design. And what he says is that it's not about necessarily having this googly high-spec environment. It's about putting the best brains in a space where they can bump into each other and they have complete and utter freedom about how they interact with one another. And I think this is a great example if you ever say, I'm not really sure if our design is funky enough. It doesn't have to be funky. It's about autonomy and control. So when I talk about one of the other things that really drives that space and why that space worked, it's about community. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I see is driving exceptional engagement in businesses and what I call the 4 C's. And I think that that example there of Building 20 is just a great sort of microcosm of this, that people had this incredible cause. They were given complete control over the space. They were given the opportunity to think when they needed to, and they had such a compelling community. So the first is cause, and I think when we think about cause, it's tough because we tend to think about the kind of cause that maybe the guys at Building 20 did, which was obviously to save the world. Or we think of cause of somebody that's maybe in a nonprofit. But cause can be very individual, and it doesn't have to be something that's like cause with a big C. Is anybody familiar with this artwork? Yeah, have you seen the art of the brick? Did it tour here? Unbelievable. Really, really moving. But this is a great example. This is actually a piece of artwork called Yellow by a guy named Nathan Sawaya. And the story about Sawaya is very interesting. I think it's a perfect microcosm of cause and the importance of cause and how it can be quite individual. So Sawaya was an American attorney, good Jewish boy, went to school, became an attorney. His parents were so proud, and he would do his attorneying all day, and then he'd go home at night and he'd build Lego artwork. And he found that every day he was going home and building Lego artwork, and on the weekends he was building Lego artwork, and he couldn't stop thinking about his Legos. And so one day he decided, you know what, I'm not going to be a lawyer anymore. I'm going to be a Lego brick artist. But he believed individually that mattered more, that he could make more of a difference to the world being a Lego brick artist than being an attorney. Now some of us might say, being an attorney is a pretty important job, so I'm not sure where he thought this was more important, but for him this was his cause. And because he tapped into this cause, he was able to create some really innovative artwork. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you go see it. It is, I find it moving, and I think it's something quite special. But it's recognizing that we can tap into the cause. Maybe the cause of somebody is being the best possible barista. Maybe that cause is taking the absolute best copies for the day. But how can you tap into the cause of your employees, an individual cause? I think that's really important in creating innovation and creating engagement. So a little bit about Hatch. Hatch has we use an online survey tool as one of our human analytics tools, and we have now more than 30,000 respondents. And so this is one of the statistics that we've been able to pull from some of our data. And what we found is that 94% of respondents said that the more meaning their job has, the more likely they are to be creative. So just think about that. If you can find what that meaning is, that very individual meaning, that the data says that that will actually help them be more creative and engaged in their job. The next is around control, and I really use control to say the opposite of control. Giving people control back, giving people a sense of autonomy in their day-to-day lives. And that autonomy can be a choice of where they work every day. It can be a choice of whether to come into work or not. You could go to the full Netflix model where people sign off their own expenses or take whatever holiday they want. Maybe that's a bridge too far for some people. But it's about offering over that level of autonomy. And this isn't just like a nice to have, oh, it's a squishy, happy sort of experience. This is some data from a longitudinal study done by Cornell University. So what Cornell did is they took teams of the same business and they split them in half. And they said, you're the team doing the same work, but we're going to change one thing. We're going to give one team complete autonomy. Again, decide how they want to work, they sign off their own expenses, they self-direct in their own teams. Or we're going to have a team that is highly command and control, doing the same work. The teams that had higher autonomy grew 4 times as fast. And this is about the money they made. They grew 4 times as quickly, but they also experienced 30 to 40% less attrition. So people left less and they made more money. The only difference being command and control versus autonomous teams. So giving people over control will drive innovation, will drive creativity, will drive the bottom line of your business. The next is contemplation. I've showed the loo roll for a reason. Why have I showed the loo roll? Because there was an interesting study done by Accenture. They spoke to FTSE 250, so in America, or in Fortune 500, forgive me, Fortune 500 executives in America, and ask them, where do you find your most contemplative time? You're figuring out where I'm going with this, aren't you? They said 2 places, the shower or the toilet. Now, there's got to be something wrong with that the only place that people can find time to think is on the toilet. If you haven't read the book Thrive by Arianna Huffington, I strongly recommend it. It was literally a life-changing book for me. For starters, she's a big giant nerd like me, so the last 20 pages is just bibliography. But what Huffington found is basically incredibly successful woman, right, who woke up one day in a pool of her own blood. She had passed out from exhaustion, broken her nose on the side of a table, and basically had woken up in a pool of her own blood. And on her way to the hospital, to the emergency room, she said, wait a minute, if this is success, I'm not sure I want to be a part of this. And she went about to look at different ways that people can thrive that are not about worshiping at the altar of overwork. And I think as a world, we have created environments where we truly worship at the altar of overwork. And we overemphasize work, 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 being the first in, the last out, and don't consider the importance of contemplation. And yet the data is so clear. And if you need more than I can certainly cover in the 30 seconds I can give to this slide, please pick up Thrive and see all of the data that she's collected about how contemplation can drive new thinking. But in essence, we know that without 20 minutes of uninterrupted time, all we're doing is churning out old ideas that are lipstick on a pig that look like they're new ideas. And they're not. They're just churning out the same stuff. And so if we want true innovation and engagement and healthier workforce, then you do that through offering contemplation, the time and the space to think. So what we got from our data, and this is sort of scary about this idea of worshiping at the altar of overwork, is that 71% of employees of our 30,000 respondents say that they don't take quiet time during their workday to think or reflect, as they fear they would be seen skiving by their manager. Basically, they fear that if they take even 5 minutes to think about an issue, they'll be seen skiving by their managers. Do you think that this is global data? Do you think that's pretty accurate for this country? I'm seeing some nodding heads. But you're not one of those managers, are you? No, of course not. So the last is community, and I think this is really interesting. I think this is the most important element of how we can create competitive advantage and engagement in our work environments, and also how we can drive that sense of innovation in our communities, in our work communities. There's a lot of talk lately about sitting being the new smoking, right? We've all heard that, haven't we? It's probably why we're all very active in this room. But actually, Brigham Young did a longitudinal meta-analysis of different studies and said, in fact, loneliness is the new smoking. That if you look at the impact of loneliness, it is more than that of smoking or obesity-related illness combined. So it is a higher mortality, early mortality indicator than both smoking and obesity for someone to be lonely. And you say, but how can we be lonely? We're all working together. Well, at least in the UK, they're saying that by 2040, 50% of people will be recorded as living in single-person dwellings. So think about that. Half of people will be living alone. And then they'll get into the tram or the tube. They don't look at each other because they're British, and we don't do that, right? I'm American, but I'm British. And then we come into the office and we sit at a desk and we email the person sitting next to us. And we wonder why people are lonely. So how can we drive a sense of community in our environment? Because I think that is going to be the key element. That's what Google does. It's not for Google about their googly design. It's about creating a tribal sense of community. Now, this is reflected also by some data that I have from the Gallup State of the Workplace report, but this is from the Hatch data. 89% say relationships with their colleagues are a primary contributor to their sense of engagement in the workplace. The Gallup in the Workplace State of the Workplace study found that the single biggest indicator whether someone would stay in their job for the next year was whether they had a best work friend. So think about this as you're considering what happens to attrition, okay? So maybe you're losing 20%, 30% of your business every year, and you're thinking, okay, that costs us a lot, but even consider more deeply what that costs, because each one of those times somebody leaves, that's somebody's best work friend who's walking out the door. And that has a significant impact on their sense of engagement in the workplace. So I'm going to play you a very short sound clip, and I want to see how many of you all recognize the sound. I saw a few people got a little excited actually. I saw a spark in their eyes. Ooh. So why did I play that for you? So I think there's something we have to recognize about this archetypal desire to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, to be a part of that community. And this is our little one of our inspirational mascots, our little origami Yoda. But why are we so turned on by the idea of Star Wars? Why do we get so excited about the idea of being a Jedi? It's quite interesting as well. They found that the single most common in the census, that the single most common non-traditional religion people checked was that they said they were Jedi. So if you weren't Hindu or Muslim or Christian, you ended up being Jedi. Now people might say that's just being cheeky, but actually people feel a real connectedness to this story because it's about archetypal belonging. It's about wanting to be a part of something bigger than yourselves. And that's what you can do in your organizations to create that sense of connectedness. Now if you're saying, Monica, this is nuts. Okay, you've gone a little bit off the deep end. We're here to talk about workplace and engagement and about our businesses. So I'm going to give you an example, a real life example. We have a tool that we use at Hatch called Fido, and it's a little mechanism where we ask people to take pictures of different settings in their work environment and we analyze it. And one of the things that we ask people to do at Google, it was tested at Google, was to take different pictures of settings and say why they responded to them, why they were inspired. And they kept taking pictures of the slide. Now you say, of course they did. They took pictures of the slide because it's googly, right? But here's the thing about the slide. Why do the Googlers love the slide? It's not because it's fun. It's not because it's funky and different. But actually, you're not allowed to go down the slide until you've finished your probationary period. So it's not about it being funky. It's about it meaning that we belong. This is really interesting. This is what Joseph Campbell says is one of the challenges with our lives now, that people need to be born twice. They need to be born once into their families and the next into their communities. And so what Google discovered is actually they don't need to have a slide at every location, but they do need to have a mechanism for people to feel like they belong. So you don't have to have a slide in your office, but how are you making people feel like they belong? How are you saying you're a part of our business today and that matters? So the last little story I'll tell you is about this guy. I always like to end with a little quote. So this is from a great book called Where Great Ideas Come From by Stephen Johnson. And he says, chance favors the connected mind. So create the connectivity of those 4 C's. Create opportunities in your business for connectivity. And perhaps genius, you won't become a genius, but genius will alight on you and your business as well. Thank you guys very much. I hope you enjoyed that. And